This is part 2 of Design and Composition, the Elements of Picture Making. Moving on now to another element of picture making, right here. It's called parallels. Degas understands the importance of parallels because parallels create a strong composition. And I'll be talking about parallels later in the course. The reason that parallels create a strong composition are, for example, think about holding one twig or stick in your hand. Let's say that this red line represents that stick. It can easily be broken if it's a thin stick. However, if I add another stick, now the two sticks together, if you try to break them, will be a little more difficult. If I add a third stick and a fourth stick and maybe even a fifth stick, now it's going to be very difficult to break those sticks in half, if at all. You might not be able to break the sticks in half. And that's because now they have gained in strength through the number of sticks that have been added. And the same idea is applied to a composition. When you have parallels within a composition, the composition gains in strength. When you add parallels, don't make them exactly parallel to each other like that. That's too monotonous and disturbing to the viewer. So what needs to be done is that you vary the direction a little bit like that, so that there isn't strict parallelism occurring. You're creating a harmony of directions because the directions are similar but not exactly the same. And that's what Degas does here. This kind of parallels can also be established through gradation. You see right up here where the principles of design are? Gradation is another principle. So if you have a gradation of direction, you also have parallels, but they're not exactly parallel to each other. So if you look at the painting here, you can see those parallel lines running across the picture, and I'll start right here at the edge of the table. Then there's another parallel line right there, and it's picked up over here by the contour of the man's arm. It's not exactly lining up with these other edges here, but you get the feeling that the line is continuing over like this, and then another line up here, and then a line down here. But you see that these lines are not exactly parallel to each other. There's some variation in their direction. There's a gradation of direction. There's more space here than there is here. More space here than there is here. So the lines are gradually diminishing as they move toward the right, thereby avoiding strict parallelism, which you should always avoid. But don't avoid parallels that are nearly exactly parallel. If you avoid parallels, then your compositions are going to lack strength. I should mention that you can have lines going in exactly the same direction, that is, being in strict parallel to each other, if the lines are far enough apart so that they don't become disturbing. It's only when the lines are too close together and in strict parallel to each other that they will become disturbing. So that means, for example, I can have a line up here like that, and then I can have a line down here that is in exact parallel to this line up here, and it won't be disturbing because they're far enough apart. But as soon as I add a line that is too close like that, then it becomes disturbing. And it appears too monotonous, too much the same. And sameness is the kiss of death of a work of art. You need variation, variety. And therefore, don't put lines that are close to each other in strict parallel to each other. So if I add another one here, you see it's not very interesting. But as soon as I vary the direction a little bit, it becomes more interesting. Now you see I changed the directions a little bit, and I think you find that now those parallels are much more interesting when they're not in strict parallel to each other. Now if you look down here, I just added the word interval. I just remembered that that was missing from this list, and interval is very important. If you look at these lines and the spaces between them, you see that the spaces are different. There's much more space here between these lines than there is over here, and then there is less space over here than there is over here. So there are a variety of different intervals of space between these lines, which helps to add interest to them. So I'm going to circle interval over here, which is another element of picture making that you need to apply to your compositions. And it's not just interval of different spaces. Always add variety of through different or unequal spaces between shapes and lines. But it doesn't just apply to the spaces. It also applies to unequal intervals of values found on the value scale that you'll be learning about later on in the course, and also unequal intervals of color on the color wheel that you'll also be learning about. So these intervals of space need to be irregular, not the same, in order to add the greatest amount of interest to a composition. I think what I'm going to do is show you an example of what I mean when I talk about unequal intervals of values that should be selected from the value scale to do your value pattern with. And I'll be getting into more detail about this later in the lessons on value patterns. So what I'll do is I'll just quickly draw, or paint rather, a value scale here, and I'll show you how you can bring the value scale into harmony so that there's a harmony of values between all the values. And I'll begin with the darkest value, black, down here, and then I'll establish white up here, and then a middle value. Now for the next value, that needs to fall between the white and the middle value. But before I continue, I think I'll put a line around this value scale like that. So now the next value is a value between those two values. The lightest value and the middle value would be something like that. And then down here, between the middle value and the darkest value. Now for the next value, down here, a value that falls between this value and this one here, the black at the bottom. And then another value up here that falls between this value and that one. Needs to be darker. I'm doing this very fast, as you can see. It's a little too fast. And then another value over here that falls between this value and this one, like that. And then up here, a value that falls between this value and that one. So I should have 9 values. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's correct. And I'll clean it up a little bit. Now this is very rough, but you can see a gradation of values running from the white down to the black. You'll be learning about this in more detail later on, but I'm just touching upon value patterns now by showing you that the values that you select should be unequal in interval. And the way that works is, let's say, for example, one of your values that you're going to be using within your value pattern is this one. And then the next one would be this one value apart from this value. Then, let's say, I'll use values down here. And I'll use these two that are next to each other, this one and this one. Now there are unequal intervals between these values. There's more space between these values, this one and that one, than there is between this value and that one. You see how much less space there is here? So there are unequal intervals here. In addition to that, you need to consider the interval between this value and this one here, which adds another interval that is greater than either of these two. And in addition to that, you need to consider the interval between this value and the one way down here. So now there is an even greater interval between the values. So there are a number of different values and a number of different intervals between these values, creating interest through the fact that all of the intervals between these values are different. There's another interval of space between this value and this one down here that I haven't indicated yet. So it's like this. Lastly, there isn't really an interval because the two values are next to each other, which are these right there. But they also create a value contrast, but it's a very subtle value contrast because the values are so similar to each other, but nevertheless they must be considered, and therefore I'll add them to these intervals of values. So I have a total of 6 different degrees of value contrasts. Those values that are near each other, such as these two, create the weakest value contrast, while this value here and this one down here create the strongest value contrasts. So you have a combination of strong and weak value contrasts occurring within this kind of selection of values at different intervals, creating the greatest amount of variety and therefore the greatest amount of interest. Interest is achieved through variety. Now watch what happens when I select values that are at equal intervals to each other. You don't get that kind of variety of value contrasts, and therefore your painting isn't going to be as interesting. So here you see the intervals of space between these values are the same. There are 4 values just as there are 4 values here. And if I do a painting with these values like that, and then I'll add this one and this one like that and the other one over here, it seems to be interesting, but when I add these other values over here that are at unequal intervals, I think you can see that there is a greater variety. Now this value here is the same value as the background over here. So what I'm going to do is enclose this like that, and I'll do the same up here. Which do you think is more interesting? Which holds your attention more? I think this is more interesting. There's more variety, or more variety in terms of different degrees of value contrasts, which is what the irregular intervals of space give you compared to this one here. So this is just an abstraction, as you can see, but if I did an actual painting using this irregular interval of values, I think I would wind up with a much more interesting painting than if I applied these values over here that are at equal intervals. So now getting back to Degas' painting, he applies this principle of unequal intervals between the values, which results in this strong-looking value pattern, and a very interesting value pattern because of this variety of different degrees of value contrast that is established through these unequal intervals between the values. Moving on now to another element of picture making, which is this one here, suggestion. Now, how does suggestion figure into this painting? Well, the way it works is that at the center of interest, that's where most of the detail is established. That's where the image appears more finished looking, while at the peripherals of the painting, further away from the center of interest, the images become more suggestive, less detailed, less exact, less precise, less finished looking. Thereby, by doing that, less attention is drawn to unimportant parts of the painting, and more attention is drawn to the center of interest, which is the most important part of a picture. So more attention is drawn right here, where the heads are located. That's where the most detail is found, and that's where the greatest amount of finish occurs. If you look down here, this part doesn't look very finished, and down here, there isn't much detail at all. So as you move further away from the picture, less and less detail, less and less of a finished look should appear, and it should appear more suggestive rather than more finished looking. You'll notice over here that I've made a change. And what I did was add a few more important elements of picture making that cannot be neglected. And they are number, variety, density, simplicity. That one is very important. And then there is idea and variation. What I want to focus on now is structure. And when I talk about structure, I'm referring specifically to the underlying structure, which is composed of a framework structure of lines, a kind of skeleton to which the values are attached. It's a linear structure that holds the values in place, supports them, so to speak. And it is established within the picture area, which is the area of the shape on which you're painting the picture. So all of this is the picture area within this shape here, which is referred to as the format shape. So if you look over here, you see picture area, and then down here, format shape. I'll be talking more about the underlying structure in other videos as well. It's a very important subject, and what I'm going to do now to begin with is, first of all, I'm going to make this painting lighter in value so that you see the darker lines better that I'm going to draw right over this picture. So let me begin by dividing the picture area with these straight lines like this, starting there, another one here, another diagonal there. Then Degas adds opposing diagonals to these diagonals that are moving toward the right. And this diagonal and this one and that one provide the opposing direction to these diagonals. So these are moving toward the right, while this one and that one and that one are moving toward the left. So there's movement and counter movement, which establishes balance. When you introduce opposition, you introduce balance. Balance through opposing forces. Now these diagonals here also help to slow down the eye as it's moving toward the right. Now the repetition of this diagonal moving toward the left and that one sets up a rhythm. Rhythm is established through repetition. Also, these diagonals moving toward the right establish a rhythm through repetition. And the fact that these diagonals here are in parallel as well as these helps to create a stronger composition. Remember what I said about lines being in parallel. And if you look up here, you see that Degas adds these vertical lines, which are also parallel to each other, adding further strength to the composition and giving some relief to all of these diagonals that are found in the composition. And there's another diagonal right there that I haven't indicated yet. So if you look over here, I'll circle balance because I just talked about balance. Also rhythm. You see that right over there. And repetition, which is right up here, where the principles of design are. Usually when rhythm is talked about, it means that there is some variation within the repetition, that there isn't strict repetition. I want to point something out to you over here in the painting, right here where I'm erasing this line. There's an empty space here between the two lines, this one and that one. You'll notice that I had the line going across like that before, when in actuality there is no line here. And that line that goes across like that is actually referred to as an implicit line or an invisible line. The brain actually completes the line. It's called closure. And if you look over here, right there, you see the word closure. If something is incomplete, the brain actually completes it so that you get the feeling that it is complete, even though it isn't. So even though there isn't a line over here, an actual line, or the edge of the table, you get the feeling that this line continues like that into the other line or edge of the table over here. So to indicate that this is not an actual line, but what is called an implied line or subjective line or invisible line, I added these dots. And the same occurs right over here. This line here continues. The brain actually, as I said, continues the line, and you get the feeling that there's more to this line than the line stopping here. You get the feeling that it continues over. So therefore the structure is more like this, creating this large triangle shape that you see here. There's a triangle shape right there as well. You see that triangle shape? There are a series of triangles that Degas uses, as well as the rectangular shapes that you see up here, created by these vertical lines. Now, Degas has all these straight lines dividing up the picture area. But when you have a lot of straight lines, you need to provide the composition with some relief by way of curved lines. And here again, this is where balance comes in, where an opposing force is added. Balance is force and counterforce. You see this vertical line right there? It actually extends further down, like this. There's an alignment of the contour of the woman's back here with the contour of the bottle that's over here, thereby extending that vertical line down further. All these lines dividing up the picture area into this framework structure that underlies the picture also creates a variety of different sized shapes. So you have a shape here that's a large shape, and another one here that's smaller, then one here that's even smaller, and even smaller one here, and here's a shape, and here. So there are a variety of different sizes of shapes, helping to create an interesting division of pictorial space. To show you more clearly what the rhythm of the diagonals that are moving to the left look like, I'm going to eliminate some of these lines. And here you can clearly see the rhythm set up by these parallel diagonal lines. Now I'll show you other diagonals moving in a different direction that set up a rhythm because they have been repeated. You see all these diagonal lines being repeated like this sets up a rhythm. And that's what you need to do in your compositions. You need to set up this kind of linear rhythm through repeating a line. You can clearly see that the diagonals are parallel to each other, thereby strengthening the composition. Degas clearly knows the power of parallels, and he uses them in his compositions. The parallel lines do not have to be straight lines. You can have curves that are more or less parallel to each other, such as these, for example. And if you use those kind of parallel curves, you'll be able to strengthen a composition that has curved lines. Now, once again, I want to focus on dominance, and every good composition has a dominant direction. And in this composition, the dominant direction seems to be the diagonal moving toward the right. And that movement toward the right is countered by a subordinate direction. Every composition that is a good composition will have a dominant and subordinate directions, lesser directions. And those lesser directions are set up here by this edge of the table moving in the opposing direction to the dominant direction, and as well as these other diagonals over here. So those are the subordinate directions. Then there is the vertical direction set up not only by these vertical lines in the background here, but the shapes of the figures have been oriented to form a vertical direction like that, which oppose the main direction or dominant direction toward the right. And whenever you repeat a direction such as the vertical direction of these figures being repeated in the background by these verticals, you strengthen that direction. And you strengthen the composition as well. Now, besides a lot of straight lines in this composition, Degas introduces curved lines to contrast with those straight lines, to give relief to all of those straight lines, and to provide emphasis through contrast of line. So there's a curve right there and right there. And then there's a curve here at the side of her face. There's a curve here. And these curves are making oval shapes. Like that. Her hat, too, is an oval shape, contrasting with the angular shapes found elsewhere in the composition. And there's an oval shape right there. There's a curve right here and on contour of his hat. His back has a curve to it. So there are a number of curves that contrast with the straight lines. And right here at the collar of her dress, there's a curve, as well as right there at her jawline. On the man's face, there's a curve here where his beard is. On the glass at the bottom, there's a curve. Then there's an oval right there at the bottom of the glass. Here where the bottle is, there's a curve, and another curve over here, and at the top there's a little oval. And you'll notice that these curves are focused around this area where the center of interest is to draw attention there. And over here, you can see a little curve and a little curve there, and then there's a straight line here. Essentially, what this composition is in terms of line is curves seen against straight lines, as I pointed out to you. So here's an extreme simplification of this plan of line that Degas established. It's a plan. The plan is to place curved lines and curved shapes against straight lines and angular shapes. So The reason for it is to give relief to the angular and straight lines through the introduction of oval shapes and curves, and to draw the attention here, where the center of interest is, through contrast. The eye will go where the greatest amount of contrast occurs. So in terms of line, this is where the greatest amount of contrast occurs, right there. Curved lines against straight, and it attracts the attention. Now the reverse could be done. For example, instead of curved lines being played against straight lines, you could have curves like this that are dominant, and then you introduce straight lines like that, which are smaller in size, just as here in Degas' painting these curves are smaller in size than the straight lines, and there are fewer of them than the straight lines and angular shapes. So in this diagram here you can see that there are fewer straight lines and there are more curves, and they're placed together or grouped together here to draw attention to them through this contrast of straight lines seen against curves. Always remember that one kind of line, either the straight line or the curve, must dominate, which means that more of one kind of line needs to be seen than another. Just as you see in this diagram here, there are more curves than there are these straight lines, so therefore the curves dominate. What I'm going to do now is a quick rough color sketch in which the curved lines dominate instead of the straight lines, to show you what that looks like. When you begin, you need to keep those principles of design and elements of design in mind, as well as these other elements of picture making. Try to think about as many of these as you can in your practice work to try to get them into your painting. You can't think of all of these at once, so as you move along with your painting, with working up the composition, more and more of these elements of picture making should pop into your head, so that you're thinking about dominance and balance and rhythm and line and symbols here, for example. That's another element of picture making. So you begin with an idea, and here is the word idea. That's an element of picture making. There needs to be something that you want to communicate, something that motivates you into wanting to paint the picture in the first place. The theme here, I think, is going to be on destruction. I'll show a warrior and a fire-breathing flying dragon destroying a castle. Now, I also need to decide on a design theme or compositional theme. And the reason for that is because that will organize the elements of design, as well as other elements here that need to be organized. And that design theme can be a symbol, a plan, or a pattern of some kind, which can be established here with these principles of design. If you apply harmony to the elements of design, you automatically wind up with a plan that will bring order to those elements of design, will organize them. Also, if you focus on dominance as being your design theme, that will also organize the composition. Organization means to bring order to the various parts of a composition. There are so many parts, so many elements that need to be organized, and the way that's done is by way of the principles of design. So as I mentioned, a design theme or compositional theme can be a plan. That plan could be a design principle. So if I select dominance, dominance becomes my plan, my design theme. So in this rough color sketch that I'm doing, I'm going to have the curved lines dominant. So I'm using dominance. So there's this warrior in the foreground, and you can see that I'm using curved lines throughout. The castle is on fire. There's smoke coming up. Now back here where the castle is, this is where I add straight lines. They're contrasting with the curves. And then right up here, this is where the dragon is located. And he's made up of curved lines. I'm not going to spend the time sketching all of this out. I've already done that, and I've already done the rough color sketch, which I'm going to show you in a moment. So I'm going to jump ahead and show you what that looks like. But you can see here in this rough drawing all of these curved lines, which become dominant because there are more curved lines than there are straight lines. So here are a few straight lines that can be seen in this castle in the background. So that's my plan. Playing these straight lines against the dominant curved lines. The exact opposite of what Degas did in his painting. This plan also has harmony. When lines look similar, they're in harmony. So these curves look similar. Some are larger, some are smaller, but they're all basically curves, and therefore they are in harmony. And there's also contrast, the principle of contrast, because these straight lines contrast with the curves. So this plan provides me with a number of the other principles of design as well. See how these straight lines contrast? And there are fewer of them than the curves. And they're grouped around this lower part of the picture to draw attention to the warrior right here in the foreground. Because the strongest contrasts of line occur right here, the eye is going to be attracted there. And now I'm going to jump ahead and show you what the finished rough color sketch looks like. And here it is. You can see the various things that I pointed out to you here, such as, for example, the curves, and then the straight lines in the background here. I'm not going to go through the whole thing again, but you can find these curves and straight lines on your own when you study this sketch. What I'm going to do now is end the video here, even though I haven't talked about some of these elements of picture making. I will, however, be talking about them in other videos, in other lessons throughout this art course that you're taking.